doing balanced relationships internationally, but I want to show today that relationships is not just an international phenomenon. It has its roots and origin in domestic politics. We have been arguing that balanced relationships is not just Chinese foreign policy style, but also style foreign policy that can be used by any country in the world, including the hegemonic United States. So we've been giving examples of how relationships has become either an instrument or even a system of international politics that encompasses um, all countries in the world. Now, I want to argue today that relationship is also a domestic component of all democratic politics, East or West, Eastern or Western. Um, as a counterpart, so if we could analyze domestic democratic politics from relationship point of view, then we could perhaps deepen our appreciation of how international politics has to be relational to some extent. Okay. Uh, something just something significant uh, just took place not too long ago in our department. If you're not from political science, we're talking about Department of Political Science that has something to do with relationship and how people think about relationship. And I think perhaps students in Heidelberg are not aware of what has been going on right now in Taiwan. We've just had a campaign in my department by a group of students to call for signatures um, for a statement that would denounce one of our veteran professors, Professor Pong, for his inappropriate performance during the public debate between two um, headrunners in Taipei City Mayor Governor. Professor Peng obviously asked a question which most people consider favorable to one of the running candidate, that's Mr. Lian, and the other is Mr. Ke. For students in Heidelberg who are not following what's going on in Taiwan today, um, this has been an intense campaign, um, perhaps a very rare time that the anti-established uh, candidates have had a very good chance to defeat the long-established regime in Taipei headed by KMT. It's very interesting. The campaign run by the students is to basically says that Professor Pong has misbehaved himself, so he does not act according to what his professional knowledge is supposed to guide him. So he's asking a question obviously favoring to one of the candidates. So this is very bad. So we no longer consider him to be the representative of our department. Of course, that Professor Peng never really claimed that he represented the department, but that's a different matter. The matter, of course, is that the students believe the Professor Peng, they don't want to be associated with Professor Peng. And they, through their campaign, want to claim that Professor Peng either is not representative of the department, which he's never been, or he is not part of the department. He's not considered part of the worthy member of the department. It appears to me this is a quintessential example of relational statement. It's not, it's not a uh, ideological debate. It's not a theoretical debate. It's not a debate of political thought or values. It's basically a relational statement that we don't want be associated with you. I think that's very interesting. I read the statement, which is very short and concise. Basically says that you don't act professionally, so we don't want to be part. We don't want you to be part of us. Uh, it doesn't really matter legally whether or not Professor Peng can still teach in my department. Of course, he can teach in our department because legally he doesn't do anything wrong, but it just morally or professionally he doesn't live up to the standard that the students hope him to live up to. But why this relationship is so important? Why can't students just come out and say, we want to debate you? Or why can't students write a statement that contains specific argument against his behavior? Instead of saying that we don't want you to be part of us. I think that's interesting. I mean, this is not about values. That's about social relationship. Okay. If we compare this particular behavior of students with Professor Peng's behavior, we find there could be shocking similarities between students' campaign against Professor Peng and Professor Peng's seeming obvious bias favoring Mr. Lian. Professor Peng, well, I'm saying this just based upon my own observation. I don't have any empirical study, but I guess this is quite a common sense that Professor Peng has been a very important person in the department to the extent that he has involved himself in both fundraising for the department and establishing alumni association for the department. And of course, fundraising has been successful because he has been very effective in re-establishing the alumni association. Most of the money he was able to raise for the department come from alumni association. And not to mention that alumni association is a relational group. It's not anything based on value. So he has never go out to alumni who are much senior to him and say, oh, because we are for liberalism, so why don't you come back to our department and become the alumni association, join us when we have annual reunion. He never said that. He basically just came out to look for all those seniors who graduate 40 years ago, perhaps 50 years ago, and just invite them to return to the department. So it's basically a relational campaign run by Professor Peng. One of the major alumni he was able to invite and successfully reassociate with the department is Mr. Lian's father, Lian Zhan. So Lian Zhan, being a very important senior alumnus to this department, and of course he donated a lot of resources to rebuild alumni association. The department has been in a kind of ideological or theoretical disarray for 20 years. people could understand that because of the collapse of the old system, the change of the regime, Li Denghui become the president, and Lian Zhan become part of his associate, and then they become enemies. All those chaotic transition has simply struck the department in a way that the people really have lost their direction. So it's important for this alumni association, the re-establishment of the alumni association, to regroup not just the alumni, but by regrouping the alumni, in a way rehabilitate the morale of the department. So the professors and graduates from the departments could come together annually to see senior alumni as if they're a group. And this group obviously transcend all party lines, values, generation gap, because everybody belonged to the department, came from department, or associated with department in a sense. So even though the department has lost its direction in terms of either political positioning or his pedagogical philosophy, what should the department teach? Chinese political philosophy, Chinese modern history, or Western political history, or Western political philosophy? We're kind of in disarray. We don't know what to do. At one time, I remember faculty come together say, well, we should no longer teach Chinese diplomatic history because that's a historical course. That's not the political science course. We should get rid of that. And eventually, people settled on with a course title called Modern East Asian International Relations. But basically, the substance is the same. It's about Chinese diplomatic history. But you could see the pedagogical disorder that has struck on the department beginning perhaps 20 years ago. Methodological difficulty, methodological disorder, pedagogical disorder, and also this party, what's going on in the society, all kinds of political struggling, affecting, intervening in the department, inter-department affairs. So the department was almost at a point of the collapsing, but then with this alumni association regrouping, and the department and the faculty and the graduates come back together because they all come from the department. They all associate with the department in a certain way. So this is a relational solution to a department witnessing tumultuous changes in society and the loss of pedagogical and the theoretical direction. And you could see how alumni association being the essential force for the department to come back and stand up again. Yes, go ahead.
Hello. I was wondering what Professor Peng actually asked Lian Chenwen, so the student got so upset about it.
He just asked something that about the other candidates, some accounting problems, just a kind of a harassment, I guess. So that's upset a lot of people. Well, I guess today he still doesn't think that he asked something biased, but most people think that's biased. But that's not what I'm driving at now. What I'm trying to argue is that I think Professor Peng is destined to help Mr. Lian because his father is one of the most important forces in our alumni association. And this alumni association is how the department was able to stand again, and how the department is able to raise money, and how the department is able to move back to the main campus of NTU. So everything is connected. Without Professor Peng, I doubt we could move back because he basically was the person raising almost the major fund for us to come back. But anyway, What I'm saying that he's playing this relational, not just politics, relational life. That's his understanding of the world. Relationality. That's the key word. And you see the students react in a way very similar psychologically, subconsciously, because what they want to do is to protect the reputation of the department, because Professor Peng has asking some inappropriate question during the debate. So the student wants to protect the department's reputation by disassociating themselves from Professor Peng so that they could protect the department. And they do this in a relational strategy by saying, you're not part of us. So they're not debating Professor Peng in terms of procedure. When Professor Peng came back with a long explanation of why he asked the question he asked, I see no one care or interested in answering him, because people already decided that was an excuse. Maybe that's the excuse, I don't know. But then it's interesting, people don't debate him. People want to make a decision from relationality point of view. That's what it's related to our topic today. Democratic politics is by all means relational, although we always talk about individuals, liberty, or rights. People are supposed to be rights consciousness. People are supposed to participate in politics in a way to make sure that the state will not intervene in their private life inappropriately or overly intervene in their private life. So we stress the importance of the rights. So we tend to ignore the relational component in democratic politics until perhaps, I think, in early 1990s, when we've had electoral politics arising in many parts of the world, including East Asia and Southeast Asia, then people realized at that time that election was no guarantee to liberal democratic politics. Election could sometimes even making things worse. So scholars using Indonesia or Malaysia as their example of what they call illiberal democracy, meaning that democratic procedures generate or produce increasingly intense confrontation between different ethnic groups. This reminds us a little bit of what has been going on in Chinese village politics, where I have been working on for 2 decades. I've been to I think we've been to more than 500 villages in my 12-year field research in China. I often see villages divided into surname groups. So if you come from one clan with a surname Wang, for example, and the other clan would be perhaps surname Chen. If your surname is Chen, it was almost automatically you will vote for candidate coming from the Chen clan. You're from Wang's clan, then you will automatically vote for candidate nominated by Wang's clan. This is almost impossible to change. If someone change, that's very serious matter. That would be considered betrayal to the family, to the whole clan. So in other words, democratic politics or electoral politics reinforce people's, if not primordial, but at least some kind of a group identity. People are looking for, is this, because I see this. Oh, Okay. Bothers me a little bit. Uh, Election reinforced the confrontation between two groups. In Malaysia, for example, uh, if you're Chinese, then you're supposed to vote for a Chinese candidate. If you're Malay, then you're supposed to vote for Malay candidate. And the result of election, of course, everybody would expect that a Malay regime would be beneficial only to Malay. Not only Malay voters expect that, Chinese voters also expect that. Some trying to be part of trying to form national group so that we could transcend the difference between Malay and Chinese. It has not been very successful, and sometimes election make it worse. Okay. So this is what people then call illiberal democracy, democracy that witness elections intensifying confrontation between ethnic groups. And this, of course, happens in Africa, in South Asia. If you go to Sri Lanka, for example, then you have the Buddhist and Islam groups. If you go to the voting booth, you don't expect the Islam voters vote for a Buddhist candidate. So this is illiberal politics. And then people start thinking, how should we transform illiberal politics into liberal? And that has become, seems to be, an important campaign in the second half of 1990s. Studies or even practitioners, people who fight for democratization of the world, will go around the world, go to different society, trying to come up with solution. People like, I don't know, Association for Democracy, Freedom House, they going around and setting up all kinds of indicators to see whether liberalism has been practiced or improved in certain societies, and then they can evaluate the future, the prospect of democracy. But ironically, beginning perhaps the year 2000, we've seen from year 2000 in American presidential campaign, this kind of a fundamentalist politics has been enhanced in the United States. So you've seen starting year 2000, 2004, 2008, 2012, then you see all kinds of fundamentalist groups, religious group, or those pro-American group targeting immigrants as a problem or source of a problem of the United States. This, of course, has to do with the notion of clash of civilizations, which Huntington had as a genius at kind of galvanized in the beginning of 1990. And this clash of civilization refers to a lot of recent immigrants arriving in the United States, making the United States no longer an integrated society, but disintegrated society. And this certainly affected the mood of the society and the politics to the extent that you've seen two groups of people in the United States, especially during the presidential campaign, finger pointing to one another as the source of problem. One important feature of illiberal democracy is that what democracy is supposed to protect the liberal rights of individuals. But then because you belong to different group, then we think you are not entitled to protection of rights because you belong to different group. Worse, if you belong to a enemy group, a rivalry group, a group that are supposed to be part of the system, then you're not supposed to enjoy the rights. So liberal democracy, which protect individual rights, has been an understanding shared by everybody in the system. But then people legally belonging to the system do not regard some components of the system as a part of the system, as a legitimate part of the system, and decide that these people are not entitled to rights protection. So if you gain power, you will not distribute resources fairly. You will extract more resources from the minority group or the losing group, making the next election even more confrontational, because people knows that if they lose, then it means that they lose everything. And you still see the system protect individual rights, but it only protects individual rights of those citizens belonging to the winning group. That's called illiberal democracy. Okay. With United States turning somewhat illiberal in the past decade, without those earlier illiberal democracy becoming liberalized, you've seen a very ironic situation. You've seen American government going all over the world to spread liberal institution, while those society practicing democracy has been losing liberalism, including the United States. That's very ironic. And that's what gets us to think, what has been going on in the world? How do we make sense of that? If we want to make a democracy work, obviously the democracy or the regime that winning election should protect everyone equally, right? There was equal rights. But people don't. No. I think this has been predicted by a retired professor in Taiwan in the late 60s. So early that no one could even imagine this could be happening today. Professor Hu Fo, who is a cynical academician, the first political science academician for many decades. He had discovered in late 60s and early 70s that there's something interesting about Taiwan's democratization. That it wasn't a time of democratization in late 60s and early 70s. But that he still discovered something interesting, because he had at that in late 60s you could not really conduct social survey because it was a martial law. It was a time of martial law. So what he did was he conducted social survey in class through the help of his colleagues and his students. So he conducted a lot of social survey questions. And he found something interesting. He found that the liberal tendency was particularly high among law school, social science school, and medical school. These two particular schools have scored much higher in terms of their subscription to liberal ideas, liberal values, than all the other disciplines. And for social science and law school, he could understand, because people, even though we are during martial law, professors teaching liberalism all the time in class. So students understood liberalism, and students tend to use a very idealistic liberal perspective to evaluate the regime, the martial law regime, and then holding negative attitude toward the regime. That was understandable because they're being taught that way. But why medical school? he was kind of curious and puzzled. Why medical school? And then after further exploration, then he realized it was medical school. Basically, students in medical school basically came from post-colonial families, families that had experienced Japanese colonization, and then of course this family felt civilizationally or culturally superior to Chinese, which was represented by the nationalist or Kuomintang government at the time. So their subscription to liberal values was not really about liberal values, but about their innate suspicion or disliking toward the Chinese regime. So we have two different sources of high liberal scores. One come from logic, pedagogical values taught in the classroom. The other come from family experience, suspicious and disliking toward the Chinese regime, but appearing on the liberal scale. And then Professor Hu then predicted, if someone from the same post-colonial background becoming the leader, the liberal values of these post-colonial families will not be used by them to evaluate the post-colonial leaders because they come from the same background. The leader will no longer be civilizationally inferior. And that's very interesting prediction. He made that prediction in, I think, in 1970s. I remember I invited him to a lecture. That was 1970, I think either 1977 or 1978, when I was the person doing all those academic activities for the student body. I invited him to give a lecture. At that time, he was being watched closely by the state. So we seeing a lot of intelligence people coming to his lectures. But anyway, so he gave a lecture. He talked about democratic style. That's very interesting because we've never heard about the notion of democratic style from our textbook. Basically written by American or European professors. Some translated into Chinese, we just read the English version. We never heard about democratic style as an analytical concept. As he explained, I remember, I could record today, I did not understand his logical or his analysis at that time, but recalling his remarks during that lecture, I suddenly realized what he was talking about only in 1990s. What he was talking about is that democracy is not just about one's values toward rights. It's not just about one's conviction of limited government or constitutionalism. It's not just about people's sense of power or efficacy toward politics. You know, basically we'll always ask the question, well, being a legislator is not difficult, so people like me can also be a legislator. Do you agree or disagree? That's kind of a question to measure our efficacy. If we have the sense of power to run politics or to participate in politics. So when he talked about democratic style, he was not talking about constitutionalism or limited government. He was not talking about people's sense of efficacy. He was not talking about people's sense of rights. All this presumably are given. Let's say we all agree that the government should be limited by constitution. The government should be limited by popular elected legislatures. The government should open channels for citizens to participate. And citizens have rights to articulate a different opinion. All these values, democratic and liberal values, let's say are given. Then Professor Hu predict in actual behavior, when people answer the question, they all answer positively. But in actual practice, people could not really observe their own values. If this is something related to someone who they don't consider being a worthy member of the society. So if you consider, if you look at the government, the practice of government, you could immediately point out what has been going wrong in their practice, what procedure they fail to follow, what rights they fail to protect. You could immediately tell. But when it comes to myself, then I couldn't restrain myself from abusing my power. That's interesting. You know, one of my Indian colleagues, that was not too long ago, I think 2009, she was joking, but she was really not joking. She was talking about Indian politics, Indian democracy. When she said that, what came to my mind immediately was Professor Hu's analytical notion of a democratic style. She said that if you want to understand Indian democracy, you have to understand in India, people believe everyone should follow the line. Everyone should kill, except me. She said that was our Indian style. So if you listen to an Indian, he or she will talk all those wonderful things, but coming to himself or herself, people don't follow the rules. people trying to find loopholes, trying to go through back doors, find relationship. So Professor Hu predict that if someone not belonging to our group becoming the leader, we will apply all the liberal values to criticize him, to restrain his or her power. If someone from our group coming to power, we will perhaps also evaluate him against the liberal values coming to our own affairs. But we will loosen our criteria if our leader is doing something in violation of liberal values to our enemies. That's his prediction, which seems to be very precise if you look at today, what happened today. In other words, who belongs to the system is very important or essential to the operation of democratic politics or liberal values. This is true not just to the Taiwanese democracy, but also to all democracy in the world. This is a universal argument. This is not just a Confucian argument, although Confucianism could make sense of this even more apparently. Because in Confucianism, if you don't belong to my group, then you should be treated differently. Actually, treating someone differently is itself a statement of identity, a statement of a group membership. So you have to treat people belonging to different circles differently according to Confucianism. But you don't have to be Confucius. As long as you have rivalry, seriously intense rivalry, which you don't want to be part of that rivalry group, then you would not apply the same liberal values to that group. You would sometimes even willing to see their rights being violated. So that seems to be a very powerful argument for me, but I was unable to make sense of it in 1977 or 78. And I think Professor Hu himself did not know how his prediction or his analysis could apply to the real world, because he didn't really have an empirical case. We haven't started democratization in 77 or 70. Well, a little bit, but not really to the level of a society being called democracy. Until very, very recently, probably 20 years ago, the Professor Hu's prediction could be put on test. And now we've seen all kinds of practice, not just in Taiwan, but all over the world. We see illiberal democracy becoming more popular than we thought it would be. We would think that illiberal democracy would be gradually dying out if we practice election long and frequent enough. People would learn their rights, people would understand procedures, and people would begin to watch one another if people follow procedures. That's what we expect. So we believe that election is the most important. If you look at the Journal of Democracy, which is the leading journal which studied democracy or democratization in the world, they have an election watch in every issue, telling you how a particular society is doing in terms of elections and who is being elected and all kinds of reports there. It almost appeared that election becomes becomes equivalent to democracy or democratization. So election becomes so important that people start losing sight of who has the legitimacy to participate in electoral politics. I think that's what the reading today is about. So we've conducted all kinds of social survey, asking questions about people's feeling toward different groups. We find something very interesting because the survey was only carried out. I'm not sure the same question being asked in other places. Maybe the same questions were asked in other places, but then I have to find out. But a similar set of questions being asked in Asia, including Philippines, which is not Confucianism, right? Who's a Catholic and just Islamic, but not Confucianism. And this speaking, they're not using the same Han character system either. What we find is consistently, at least in Korea, in Japan, in China, and in Taiwan, for obviously heavily Confucian societies, is that we ask people if civilian groups or representatives of people in legislatures, delegates, or interest groups causing chaos in society or raising problems, causing troubles in society. Would you support this kind of behavior? Would you support those civilian groups acting disobediently at expense of a social order, a stability? I think predominantly of the voters in this fourth society provide a negative answer. So they don't support civilian groups, interest groups, private citizens for their own interest causing troubles causing disorder in the society. If we look at the results of these few questions, then we say, oh, that means this is Confucian, this is not liberal, right? Because liberal supposed to, even though you disagree with them, you would allow them to speak up. You would value people's rights to articulate opinion more than social order, to some extent, right? To a large extent, actually. So we say, oh, this shows the alienation from liberal values. However, there's another set of questions asking people if they would approve the government to act strongly on those groups which cause disorder or which cause chaos in the society. Would you support the government to silence them or to regulate them or to do something about these troublemakers? Then you see predominantly among the answers, people say no. They don't support the government to act strongly or negatively on those troublemakers. If you only look at this set of questions, you will say, oh, then East Asian society has become liberal societies because they don't like to see the government intervene or silencing groups causing troubles, right? But then you put the both sets of questions together, then you have a liberal indicators and sort of illiberal values at the same time, simultaneously. How do you make sense of this? It doesn't make sense from liberal point of view because you don't expect someone who support you don't expect someone who does not support civilian groups or interest groups causing troubles, and at the same time not support the government to take strong action in order to preserve social order and stability at the expense of civilian disobedience. That's interesting. How would you make sense of this? Why would someone ask yourself, would you answer these two different set of questions in a liberally consistent way, or you would do it differently? Would you support the government to take regulative actions on groups causing troubles? Would you support civilian groups for their own interest, generating chaos, political chaos, or disorder? If we take sunflower movement, what we would expect to see a general voters in Taiwan to say about sunflower movement is this. Sunflower movement is not good because it causes a lot of disorder in society. But the government should not intervene and silence or control this sunflower movement. Would you see this as a contradiction? Or would you see this as common sensible, understandable? Someone who dislike sunflower movements, the problem, the social order caused by the sunflower movement, but then disagree with any strong action taken by the government. How do you make sense of this? I'm just giving an example. There was no question about sunflower movement in our social survey. Okay, but I was just asking, use this as an example. How do you make sense of this? Someone else? How do you make sense? Ra, you want to say something?
Yeah, I'm thinking this is confusion as well, right? Because the chaos that is created by the opposition or by the sunflower movement will go away naturally, because the leader he's not allowed to intervene in this process. If the leader intervenes, that is forceful, and then the population will also disagree with it. So he waits until until it
Right.
dissolves itself. Yeah.
I'm not sure when people say the government should not take strong action against sunflower movement because it will go away anyway. I cannot see people consciously think that way, although philosophically this would happen. But then would it be weird to say, well, let's just wait, they will go away? If they don't, what would you do? You say, kick them out? Maybe most people would feel reluctant to see this happen, right? If they see bloodshed, they would be, oh, no, 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 don't do this, right? So I guess philosophy of this philosophical tendency to see cycles in history may not be specifically applied to specific events, you know. But it is certainly something that people would like to see things smoothing out naturally rather than being resolved via confrontation. That's true. Yeah. You want to say something?
If we talk about sunflower, but my father is a police, and I'm favorable student. But if you ask this question, is kind of it's really difficult for me. But I think various opinions is the fundamental value in a democratic state. So I think everyone has the right to speak out.
I think according to democratic values, everyone has rights to articulate his or her opinion. I have the suspicion this is not an issue of value, because general public doesn't seem to support any group to cause disorder, whatever reasons they have, the general public. So they're not expressing liberal values when they look at this kind of chaotic politics. But we have to remember that general public also not support the government to take strong action. I think that's a seeming irony there. If we look at this as a issue of liberalism, they will have no solution to this contradiction, because people obviously do not have consistent attitude toward within this liberal logic. But if we consider self-restraint as a value, then you could make sense of the seeming contradiction, right? Sunflower students should restrain themselves from causing disorder. The government should restrain itself from taking strong action. Everybody should restrain themselves. If you take the self-restraint as the bottom line of the general public. That means that no one should act arbitrarily, no one should be self-centered, no one should only consider from their own perspective. So everyone should restrain him or herself from imposing the wished or desired result onto the others. Then we as the general public would feel comfortable. If you ask me, and then this is not consistent, so what the policy should be? I don't know what policy should be. But I know I don't want to see people being, people lost themselves. I don't want to see people consider themselves being the most important person in the world. I don't want to see anyone being self-centered, imposing his or her views on the others. So everyone should restrain themselves. Isn't that the same policy that taken by the Hong Kong, not governor, what do we call Hong Kong government today? We don't call it governor. What do we call him? District. What do we call the administrator?
Chief executive.
Okay, yes.
Chief executive?
Oh, okay, chief executive. All right, okay. I think that's the same position he has been trying to take to show people how restraining I have been acting. So it's your turn to show your restraint, right? And if you look at the handshaking between Xi Jinping and Abe, you would see the same style, that Xi Jinping was acting very reluctantly when shaking hands with Abe, because China had given in, have conceded significantly on their position on the East China Sea's territorial dispute. So he would have to act very seriously. If he act very happily, then he will be in big trouble because he had conceded. Abe shows some smile. You just look at their facial expression, you know who gave in. It has to be Xi Jinping giving. If Abe was the side, if Japan was the side giving in more, then Xi Jinping must act warmly to make up the concession made by Japan, right? But Xi Jinping act very coldly. That means that Abe should act warmly in order to make up the concession made by China. So everybody should be self-restrained, right? So you should try to relate to one another. You relate to one another in such a way that if the other side has done something wrong, then the first step is show your compromise. That means you're tolerant, you're self-restrained, and if the other side does not return on my concession, then I would have better legitimacy to act strongly in the next step. If the other side was really bad, have done something terribly, then I must act strongly even though I am in an extremely weak position. Isn't that the same as a balanced relationship? We talk about balanced relationship for the weaker side to act very strongly in order to show disapproval as a warning to the stronger side. The same thing happened in democratic politics. The student came out as the weak side, so they act strongly to show their determination to achieve their values. So you don't expect that, right? You don't expect that in realist politics. No. But the same thing, I mean, in Hong Kong today, you see the chief executive trying to demonstrate how restraining that he has put on his own police in order to enhance the legitimacy to act strongly in the future. So that's that's how I make sense of the seeming contradictions in the general politics, in the general public, from Japan, China, Taiwan, and also Hong Kong, and Korea. You don't make sense from the liberal point of view how people feel uncomfortable with disorder caused by the disobedience or protest or demonstration, but at the same time feel uncomfortable with the government taking strong action against those civilian groups. You don't make sense of this from a liberal point of view, but you can make sense from the relational point of view. How do we make a system a system? How do we know a system is a system? It is system when the members of system are willing to restrain their own interest, the pursuit of their own interest, for the sake of stability, systemic stability. People are willing to consider other people's feeling. Then other people must be part of the system, right? That means you should be self-restraining. I remember reading some of the international relation literature claiming that self-restraint is a feature of liberal society. So for European countries to spread the idea of a European Union to the other parts of the world, basically East Asia and Africa and Latin America, they must try to spread the value of self-restraint. I think they're wrong. I think the value of self-restraint is not also European, but also East Asian and anywhere in the world. Self-restraint is the quintessential feature of the existence of a system. And system is perhaps the parallel to what we have talked about as greater self in previous weeks. The systemic membership is about greater self. If we are involved in the greater self, then we should consider the feeling of the others belonging to the same greater self or the system. So that's about a systemic identity. That's the group identity, and that's the relationality. So if we don't have this relationality as a component of our systemic politics or of our democratic politics, then you would see the problem of democratic style Professor Hu talks about. You would expect to see that when people are facing rivalry groups, they would apply different standards. That's something we should really be very cautious about when we study democratic politics. So you don't just look at election, you don't just look at whether or not voting is fair, is one person, one vote, and there's no fraud. That's we have that in Taiwan. Taiwan perhaps has the best electoral system in the world, the most efficient. You know, we know the result 2 hours after the election. I mean, it's where you find such an effective, efficient vote counting system. You know, and it's fair counting. Everybody's watching. Well, there could be a problem, but the problem is very, very limited. And then you see people vote. It's very ordered. You don't find much fraud in our system. But does that mean that we are liberal? That's why Larry Diamond invented this notion of electoral democracy. You know, we talk about illiberal democracy in the early 1990s and mid 1990s. And then this doesn't seem to be quite the same thing in Taiwan, because although we're not a liberal society, but we don't kill each other. the winning side don't kill each other, don't kill the losing side, or don't deprive the rights of the losing side. But then they don't respect the rights of the losing side. So you have to have some concept to describe this kind of society. So we come up with this idea of electoral democracy. They're not liberal democracy, but they're not necessarily illiberal democracy, but they're electoral democracy. So they have a fair, good, orderly election, and the government change hand according to the result of election. But then that's about it. So group belonging seems to be something missing in the current literature on democratization. But Professor Hu talked about that 40 years ago, amazingly. Probably that's one of the reasons he became an academician. And I think we have seen proof of his worry or his analysis in the most recent survey conducted across different East Asian societies. That is that people care about systemic identity. In order to preserve systemic identity, everyone in the system should be self-restraining. If you are self-restraining, then we don't care whether you follow procedures or you violate procedures or you may cause disorder, as long as you restrain yourself. So disorder would be would take place only to a certain extent, not overly disorderly. The government can only intervene to a certain extent, not causing bloodshed. Okay. So that's what we call systemic identity. That's what we call the relationship and the balance, rather than check and balance. Check and balance means that you have watched the government, but we don't watch the government whether they do things according to procedures. We watch the government if they restrain itself. And that's relationality. That's not checking. So we call it relationship and balance. Okay?